One of the most important things in economics is being able to measure economic growth. In this short video, I will take you through some of the important calculations necessary to be able to calculate growth in the economy. The first thing that we will look at are ways that we can measure increases in GDP. First, we can look at the percentage growth measures and how much GDP increases over a given length of time. We can also look at the per capita GDP, that is, how much of GDP each person in an economy shares. Finally, we will look at trying to determine how long it will take for GDP to increase by using the so-called rule of 72. The first formula that we will look at is trying to calculate the percent change in GDP. The formula for the change in real GDP is given by change in real GDP divided by the initial value of the GDP times 100%. In a practical sort of way, that means that we need to have an ending real GDP and a starting GDP. So our final formula, the one that we're going to use to actually do the calculation, is ending real GDP minus starting real GDP divided by starting real GDP.
Let's look at an example. South Korea's real GDP in 2007 was $1.329 trillion, and in 2008 GDP was $1.360 trillion. What is the percent growth in South Korea's GDP between 2007 and 2008? So we're going to start by writing down our formula. Ending GDP minus starting real GDP divided by starting GDP times 100%. What we're going to do next is substitute in for our starting and ending GDP the 2 years. So for example, in this particular formula, we have substituted in for ending GDP in 2008, and for the starting GDP 2007. Our next step is to look back at the problem itself and find what the GDP was in 2008. The GDP in South Korea in 2008 was $1.36 trillion. So we will substitute that in for the 2008 GDP in South Korea. Our next step is to find the real GDP in 2007. Looking back at the problem, we see that South Korea's real GDP in 2007 was $1.329 trillion. So we substitute into the formula $1.32 trillion in two places, one at the top and one at the bottom. Our next step is to subtract $1.36 trillion from $1.329 trillion, and this gives us $0.031 trillion. Next, we're going to divide $0.031 trillion by $1.329 trillion. Next, that gives us 0.023, which we're going to multiply by 100%, which gives us 2.3%. So the answer is the growth in real GDP in South Korea was 2.3% between 2007 and 2008. Another measurement of economic growth is the per capita GDP. This is the amount of GDP per person. The formula for calculating per capita GDP is per capita real GDP is equal to real GDP divided by the population of the country. The procedure for calculating per capita GDP is 1. Write down the formula, which is real GDP divided by the population of the country. 2. Substitute in the population of the country into the formula. 3. Substitute in the country's real GDP into the formula. 4. Divide the country's real GDP by its population. Let's look at an example. Botswana has a population of 2.02 million people and has a GDP of $25,380 million. What is the per capita real GDP for Botswana? Well, the first thing we need to do is to write down our formula where per capita real GDP is equal to real GDP divided by the population of the country. The second thing that we need to do is locate the real GDP of the country. In this case, the real GDP of the country is $25,380 million, and we will substitute that into the formula for the real GDP. So our formula now becomes the real per capita GDP is equal to 25,380 million divided by the population of the country. The next step is to substitute in the population of the country involved. In this case, Botswana has a population of 2.02 million people, and we'll substitute that into the formula for population of the country. When we substitute in Botswana's population of 2.20 million people, our formula now becomes real per capita GDP is equal to 25,338 million divided by 2.02 million people. Next step is to divide 25,380 million by 2.20 million, and this gives a real capita GDP of $12,506.33 per person. The answer to the question, what is the per capita real GDP of Botswana, is the per capita real GDP in Botswana is $12,506.33 per year. One of the things that happens is that we might want to know how long it might take for an economy to go from a GDP of, say, $100,000 trillion to a GDP of $200,000 trillion. We need to have a formula that allows us to calculate compound growth. And it turns out there's two very simple ones. The one that we're going to use is the rule of 72. As you may note, if you've read through the textbook, you will notice that the authors use the rule of 70. The calculation is pretty much the same. The only real difference is the number that is in the numerator. So we're going to take a look at the rule of 72. The rule of 72 is a way to calculate how long it will take for a company to double its GDP, assuming that there's a constant annual growth rate. The formula reads 72 divided by the annual growth rate will give the numbers of years it will take to double GDP. The procedure to use the rule of 72 is as follows. 1. Write down the formula 72 divided by annual growth rate. 2. Locate the annual growth rate in the problem. 3. Substitute the annual growth rate into the formula. Divide 72 by the annual growth rate. Let's look at an example of Bolivia. Bolivia grew at a rate of 3.4% per year in 2009. How long will it take for Bolivia to double its GDP? Well, the first thing to do is to write down the formula, which is 72 divided by the annual growth rate, and that will give us the number of years it will take for Bolivia to double its GDP. First thing we need to do is substitute in the rate of growth. In this case, the rate of growth for Bolivia is 3.4% per year. We'll substitute that in for annual growth rate into the formula. Next, we'll divide 72 by 3.4. This tells us that it'll take about 21.71 years for the Bolivia's GDP. So we're really saying close to 22 years for Bolivia to double its GDP. So the final answer is Bolivia will take 27.71 years to double its GDP.